Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is how low and moderate income solar programs are evaluated, trends and best practices. This webinar is presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, and we have speakers with us today from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Before I pass it over to them to begin our presentation, I'd like to go over a few quick webinar logistics. All of our attendees for this webinar are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of our webinar today. You can call in via telephone, or you can connect via your computer, mic, and speakers. If you'd like to minimize your webinar console, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled there on your screen, and you can also click on that arrow to expand your webinar console. And one of the things that you might like to do with your webinar console is to type in questions and comments. We will save about 15 minutes at the end of our webinar for Q&A with the audience and the guest speakers, so do type your questions in when you think of them. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We'll send you an email this afternoon, probably tomorrow at the latest, with a copy of the webinar slides and recording. And all those materials will also be posted on our website at cesa.org/webinars. So with that, I'd like to now pass it over to our moderator for today's webinar, Nate Hausman. Nate is a project director here at the Clean Energy States Alliance, and he is going to get us started.
Thank you, Samantha, and welcome everyone. Sure enough, I am Nate Hausman, a project director at the Clean Energy States Alliance, where I focus on solar policy. First, just a quick word about the Clean Energy States Alliance, or CESA, as we often call it. We're a national nonprofit coalition of state energy organizations. We work together to advance the rapid expansion of clean energy and bring the benefits of clean energy to all. And you can see our logos, the logos of our members on this slide. This webinar is being conducted as part of CESA's Scaling Up Solar for Under-Resourced Communities project. It's a U.S. Department of Energy supported multi-year project that seeks to accelerate the development of solar projects for three subsets of the low and moderate income solar market: single-family homes, manufactured homes, and multifamily affordable housing. Great. This webinar is on how low and moderate income solar programs are evaluated. It's going to highlight findings from a recently released Lawrence Berkeley National Lab report titled An Assessment of Evaluation Practices of Low and Moderate Income Solar Programs. And here to speak with us about their report are Ben Paulos and Eric O'Shaughnessy. We also have Sydney Forrester, who won't be presenting, but may chime in for the Q&A segment. So let me introduce Eric and Ben. First, Ben Paulos is an affiliate in the Electricity Markets and Policy Department at Berkeley Lab. He's the principal of Paulos Analysis, which provides energy-related communications, policy research, advocacy, and consulting to clients, including businesses, government agencies, nonprofits, foundations, research and consulting firms, trade associations, and media. He has an MA in Energy Analysis and Policy from La Follette Institute at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a BA from Tufts University. And also with us is Eric O'Shaughnessy. He's an independent renewable energy research consultant. His research focuses on econometric analysis of distributed energy resource and voluntary green power markets. Dr. O'Shaughnessy received his PhD in environment and resources from the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He also has an MPA from La Follette School of Public Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a BS in environmental economics and policy from Michigan State Universities. You can find more from Clean Energy Works. That's www.cleankws.com. Sorry, cleankws.com. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Ben.
Great. And Nate, it's La Follette Institute. I think we have to.
Thank you for that correction.
Honor the memory of Fighting Bob. Yeah, both Eric and I are graduates from Wisconsin, so it's a small world. Let's see, do I have control here? Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, I'm Ben Paulos, an affiliate with the lab, and we did this study we were asked by the Department of Energy to look at this question of how low-income solar programs are being evaluated. I think people on the call are familiar with this trend that the declining cost of solar has created a number of opportunities beyond just cutting pollution. Policymakers are looking for solar as a way to reduce energy burdens for low-income households, to create jobs and economic opportunity, and to make sure that public funds are being used for high-value outcomes. One additional benefit that maybe doesn't get as much attention, but it's very important, is that we pay quite a bit of money for bill assistance programs in the US at the federal and state and local level, and solar can be a way to save money on those programs. However, there are, as we know, significant barriers to going solar for low-income households. So to address those barriers, there have been over 40 low-income solar programs created in 20 different states. In most cases, a lot of these programs could be considered experimental or novel, because I think people are still trying to figure out what's working best and what the right approaches are. There are definitely some programs with a longer track record, but really there's been a lot of growth in recent years. So as programs are still being experimented with, that really puts a premium on program evaluation to know what works and what doesn't work, what's cost effective, and whether your target audiences are actually benefiting. So we took a look at these programs to see how they're being evaluated. The evaluations align with the designs and goals of the programs. What kind of data is being collected and how is it being analyzed? To do that, we collected and read over 30 documents from different programs around the country. We interviewed 10 program administrators and evaluators. And as Eric O'Shaughnessy is going to talk about, we used some data analytical techniques to see if it's possible to use outside publicly available data sources as a low-cost way to improve program evaluations. So it's important to know that we didn't really ask how the programs are doing. Instead, we asked how they're being evaluated. What we found is it's kind of hard to compare between programs because there's not a lot of standardization among evaluations, but we'll get to that. So first, a little background on the landscape of low-income solar programs. The problem of energy burdens has been persistent. The lowest income households spend about 12% of their income just for electricity, more for other household energy use. And that's about 4 times the US average for other customers. The highest burdens are found in the Southeast and New England, especially in rural areas, among elderly households and for people of color. Energy assistance programs have amounted to over $50 billion over the past decade from the federal level. That's the LIHEAP program. Plus more is spent in state and utility programs, charitable programs, all kinds of programs. So it's quite a bit of money is spent on that. Meanwhile, solar is becoming, it was initially a technology bought by early adopters and the more affluent. It's really becoming over time what I call a middle-class home improvement project. The income levels of solar adopters has been, the median income has been trending down over the years. It's still not common among households of less than median income, 80% of AMI or less, but that number is increasing over time. Berkeley Lab does extensive research on the demographics of solar adopters, and these charts are, the chart on the left is taken from that. These programs are, as I said, we count over 40 programs active in the US right now. The largest and longest running have been for on-site, rooftop solar systems, customer sited. But in recent years, community solar has been really taking off. Excuse me. Actually, this timeline shows that a little better. Community solar programs have been expanding in a number of states, and they're also scaling more quickly. I think we're going to see some very large community solar installations in places like New Jersey and Hawaii in the next year. Other states like Minnesota have been leaders in community solar, although not specifically for low-income households. The longest running programs have been on-site programs like the California SASH and MASH programs, and even city programs in San Francisco and Boulder and elsewhere. Overall, the size of the programs is adding up. The California programs, there's a suite of programs out here in California where I am, and the total expenditure is going to surpass $1 billion on these programs over the last 15 years and coming years. Even so, we're reaching only a small part of the total eligible market. The SASH program, that's the Single Family Affordable Solar Home Program, has done about over 9,000 rooftop installations. However, we have almost 6 million eligible customers in that income bracket. So there's a long way to go to extend solar out as far as it can. Nationally, we count about 200,000 homes with solar that are in the low income bracket, like 80% of area median income or less. However, that's also only about, there are about 50 million such households in the US, so there's quite a lot of capacity left. Here are a couple examples of on-site programs. For single family, the largest program is SASH, as I've mentioned. It's delivered as a $1 per watt incentive. And recently, the program administrator, Grid Alternatives, has expanded to what they call a Families First third-party ownership arrangement. So it's third-party ownership, but it's tailored for low-income households. That program has been expanded into disadvantaged communities. Those are communities with low-income demographics, but also environmental burdens in California. That program it's called DAC-SASH. Another similar example is in New York. The Affordable Solar On-Site Residential Incentive is part of the larger New York Sun program, and it provides an extra incentive for eligible households. For multifamily, there are not as many multifamily programs, but there are a few. The SOMA, California Solar on Multifamily Affordable Housing, that's the program that extends the previous MASH program, and it's really just starting up. The budget is $100 million a year, funded through the cap and trade program. So the revenues are not always certain, but it has the potential to be $1 billion over the next 10 years. And the goal is to put 300 megawatts on multifamily housing and to convey the benefits, the financial benefits to the tenants through a bill credit. In Washington, D.C., the Solar for All program has been in what they call the innovation and expansion phase, where they're testing a lot of different approaches. DC has a very complicated rooftop landscape in terms of ownership, the complicated tenant relationships. So they're really experimenting to find the best way to develop solar at scale, and also to make sure that the tenants are the ones benefiting from that. Community solar, as I said, has been rapidly growing. It's an off-site development that delivers benefits to the subscribers through a bill credit, through virtual net metering sometimes. It has a number of benefits over on-site solar. It's easier to scale, it's lower cost. It's easier to deliver benefits directly to the people you want to target. One major drawback is that it doesn't increase the wealth of the low-income customer through ownership. like owning a rooftop system makes your house worth more. It gives you an asset. A subscription and an off-site community solar does not deliver that benefit, but it delivers a lot of other benefits more easily. A couple examples. New Jersey is in the midst of what they call the community solar pilot. They initially offered an incentive for developers to have a majority of low-income subscribers for their projects. And they had so many favorable bids in their RFP that the entire award from that first round was for projects that serve a majority of low-income subscribers. So the first round is already 75 megawatts, with at least half of that going to low-income households. The Illinois Solar for All program is a multifaceted program, but it also includes community solar as well as rooftop and nonprofits. All right, so actually, if you want more information on low-income solar programs, I'd recommend the CESA directory of low-income solar programs, which is on the CESA website, cesa.org. Now I want to give a little background on evaluations. There is EM&V is the topic, evaluation, measurement, and verification. There's the theory and there's the practice. The theory is that EM&V has been highly refined in the area of energy efficiency. Energy efficiency programs are very thoroughly evaluated and verified because the verification has implications for whether the program's administrators get their cost, whether they get paid for delivering the programs. So they have to prove the savings in order to get paid. As a result, the EM&V process is very rigorously defined. It has very clear rules. It has a lot of background research, a lot of professional practitioners around the country. It has very strict standards for planning, data collection, analysis, and synthesis. This figure here, yeah, I think you can see my mouse moving. There are really two categories. There's an impact evaluation, and there's a process evaluation. The impact evaluation describes the impact of the program, impact on billing, number of participants, energy savings, et cetera, or in the case of solar, energy generation. The process evaluation describes more about why something happens or how it happens. So it relies on customer surveys, focus groups, and interviews. And it really looks at not so much the outcomes, but the process of delivering the outcomes. As I'll say later, that both of them are very important because just knowing something is delivering is great, but knowing why it delivers will help you run the program and reform the program. I think it's especially true in an area like solar, which has a lot of different drivers for why people go solar. However, then there's the actual practice of EM&V. For large efficiency programs, they really do a quite rigorous data analysis, data collection. But there are all kinds of other programs, many of which don't really have the budget to justify a detailed and in-depth evaluation. So this graphic kind of illustrates from simple to complex. The simplest approach would be simple progress tracking, how many grants are given out, how many people sign up. Verification will prove what's happening. Impacts will assess what the impact of the action is, the impact of the rebates or the installations. Then you can calculate the cost effectiveness or a cost benefit analysis to see whether what you're doing is cost effective. And lastly, the most complicated task is to assess whether your program is creating an impact on the whole market, whether there are impacts beyond the activities in your program. This kind of evaluation can be done externally or internally. The benefit of doing it internally is often that it's cheaper and faster. However, external evaluators are usually more professional, more experienced at it. But either way, the amount of rigor really depends on the budget, on what your future plans for the program are, how big the program is, and really whether the evaluation is required by statute or by regulators. So we'll see that evaluations really that we reviewed really range throughout that spectrum. It's kind of obvious to say this, but I'll say it anyway, that the evaluation process usually hinges on what the goals of the program are and vice versa. A very specific program goal can really dictate very specific data collection and very specific evaluation. A more general goal, like solar for all, if you want simply to increase participation in a program, you really don't need to evaluate it as rigorously. If your goal is greater participation, then you really need to know who's participating. How many incentives are you giving out? Who's getting them? If your goal is a little more detailed or complicated, such as to cost effectively reduce poverty, then you're going to need to know the utility bills of your participants, their income, how much it costs to do the solar installation, how much their savings, what kind of impact it has on their bills, whether your rooftop solar system is increasing home value. Once you have all of that information, you can answer a lot more questions. You can also potentially compare your low-income solar program with other strategies like energy efficiency or other kinds of anti-poverty programs. With evaluation, sometimes it's done at the end of a program, like it's a report card, but it can also be done as the program is implemented to provide continuous improvement, continuous feedback, continuous evaluation to improve it as you go. This is especially important, I think, as I mentioned, for programs that are maybe more experimental. It's good to know how you're doing as you go, so that you can provide some course corrections. Of course, to do that, it's important to plan ahead. You need to be able to collect data as you go and evaluate it on the fly so that you can feed it back into the program. Evaluations answer a number of key questions. For example, who is it creating benefits for? When you do a cost benefit measurement, typically they're done from different perspectives, from the participant's perspective, from the perspective of all utility customers or the program administrator, or even from society as a whole beyond the program. Often they ask if a program is cost effective, and just to jump to the conclusion, low-income energy programs are almost never cost effective. That's largely because the participant in the program, the low-income household, does not share in the cost of the program. With a non-low-income policy, there's always a cost sharing involved. You know, a tax credit will give you, or a rebate will give you 30% of the cost, and the customer pays the other 70%. So that really improves the cost effectiveness from the perspective of the program administrator or the utility. However, low-income low-income programs in general don't require as much of a cost sharing, because the theory is that the household is unable to share the costs, and we're doing this in order to benefit them. So from a program administrator perspective, low-income energy programs are basically never cost effective. So you shouldn't worry about that, I think, as much when you're considering low-income solar programs. An important part of all low-income programs, especially solar, is the non-energy goals. They create a class of benefits that are referred to as non-energy benefits or non-energy impacts. Things that go beyond the energy bill, like does it boost the household comfort or safety? Does it boost the wealth of the household? Those things can be, they don't appear in the electric bill, so they're more difficult to quantify. but they are really, in many cases, the primary goal of these programs. So evaluating non-energy impacts is extremely important. I want to give a few case studies that we found, that we looked at in these evaluations. Really, as I mentioned, we looked at over 30 documents. Not all programs do very in-depth evaluations, but we picked out a few that we wanted to highlight. Really, the gold standard, I guess, for full rigorous EM&V type evaluations is the California programs. They're the largest and the longest running programs, so they have the largest budget for evaluation. They typically set aside 1% of the program budget for evaluation. So that means in the end, you have millions of dollars available for evaluation. They include all of the best practices that we mentioned. They looked at market impacts. They have data quality assurance, checking, and they do calculate non-energy benefits and societal benefits. One much more affordable and modest approach was used by the Connecticut Green Bank. The Green Bank program offers incentives and leasing products for low-income households in Connecticut. They've done a variety of evaluations, but they've developed one approach that was an internal evaluation that combines their own program data with publicly available census data. And that is a very low cost way to get pretty good insight into how their program is performing. We're going to talk more about that in the next section with Eric talking about different data analysis approaches. The Hawaii program, the Green Energy Money Saver, or GEMS program, it's an on-bill financing program for solar. They collect, because it's a finance program, they collect a lot of financial data from the participants. And because of that, they are able to get a lot more insight than you would if you didn't collect as much data. They extend that to look at job creations, fuel savings, and state tax revenues. So it's not a huge program, but they really collect a lot of really interesting data in that process. And the last few here, the Illinois Solar for All program was really, we thought, an example of planning ahead. The law that created the program dictates an evaluation protocol for the Solar for All, and they very actively evaluated as they've gone, even evaluating the startup before there was any program activity. At the other end of the timeline is in Massachusetts, the Mass Solar Loan Program, which wound down last year. And as the loan, it's also a loan program, it wound down and it did a lot of analysis about loan performance, how the loans were repaid by its customers. And they shared that with banks in the hope that the banks would continue to serve that market segment. They'd continue to provide loans for low-income households going solar. And lastly, providing transparency is a best practice. A number of programs have online dashboards where they track their metrics in real time, such as grants given out or rebates. This is helpful for continuous improvement, but it's also helpful for keeping stakeholders informed and guiding the activity of vendors to know, how much money is available, where the activity is happening, and so on. One example, I mentioned how important it is to include the non-energy benefits and the societal benefits for low-income solar programs. The SASH program in California did an evaluation in 2015 where they looked at all of the cost-benefit ratios. These are the 5 different tests they used. And I won't go into detail about all the different tests, but the PCT is the participant test, and you can see that it has much higher cost-benefit ratio. Number 1, anything over number 1 is considered a higher benefit than cost. So the benefit to the participant is very high, largely because they don't really have to pay in the cost of it. These are largely fully funded programs. The other tests are from the perspective of total resource, societal, et cetera. They are all less than 1, so their benefit cost ratio suggests, like I mentioned before, with any low income energy program, that they're not cost effective from most perspectives. However, the light blue shaded areas includes those account for the non-energy benefits, and they increase the benefit ratio by about 1/4 in each category. However, the largest non-energy benefit was in the form of savings to utilities and to other ratepayers from avoided bill subsidies. California has programs called CARE and FERA that provide bill payments subsidies for low-income households. The solar programs were able to cut the payments for that, increasing the benefit cost ratio for these programs. So that's why the non-energy benefits for the participant perspective were very small, because they didn't necessarily benefit from the savings in the bill payment programs. But other people who pay for those programs did benefit from it. So that's just one example of how this dynamic works about non-energy benefits. Okay, we're going to turn it over to my colleague Eric O'Shaughnessy, who's going to talk about some data approaches for evaluation that might be useful for looking at programs. Eric,
Thanks,
are you there?
Yep, I'm here. The other La Follette panelist. So if you can advance to the next slide. The idea here and in the report is not so much to do an actual evaluation, but to provide some tips on how evaluators may go about doing this with available data. Because oftentimes any sort of evaluation data is ultimately the constraint. But fortunately, there are a lot of really good data out there in the world publicly available on solar, and we kind of walk through some ways that evaluators may be able to combine whatever program level data they have with that data to do some relatively high quality evaluations. And we split this into 2 basic approaches. One is a household level approach. This is taking household level data on factors such as income and other demographic factors, whether recipients or households received LMI incentives, etc. And the obvious benefit here is this is really the most relevant unit of analysis. You can have really large sample sizes. And the primary drawback is that household level data can be very difficult or expensive to obtain. The second approach is what we call a location-based approach. This is basically using some geographic unit, such as a census tract or a zip code, and doing the analysis at that level. The primary benefit is that this is relatively easy and oftentimes can be done with publicly accessible or easily obtained data, with the drawback being you lose some statistical power, less precise analysis, and we'll talk about that. Next slide. This is the basic idea, the kind of framework of how to go about doing this. The first step is always to collect data, and this kind of determines what goes about, how one goes about planning their evaluation. As an analyst, I'm always collecting data, and I know that oftentimes the plan can deviate from some sort of optimum because as analysts, we are somewhat opportunistic. We base analysis on what we can get our hands on. So the first step, collecting data. There's obviously gonna be some program data, maybe not everything you might want. And then there's also these publicly available sources. So installation data. The example here is TTS. That's an acronym for Tracking the Sun. This is a resource made available by the Berkeley lab. There are other data sets such as Deep Solar, published by some researchers at Stanford. Google is putting together some data. So the point is that installation data can be obtained. And the second type of data would be geographic data. Census is the most obvious example. Basically anything that would give some sort of indication at a geographic level of relevant demographic factors. And in the second step, we combine all of these, installation data, we combine geographic data with program data, and basically see what comes out. And based on that process, if we were able to obtain household level data, we do a household level analysis, or otherwise we're going to do some type of aggregation. So we'll take all these data, aggregate up them to a certain level, and then do the analysis at that geographic level. Next slide. So this is an example of just comparing these two approaches. And the key takeaway here is that you can go a long way with some basic data. You don't necessarily need really sophisticated household level modeled expensive data. You can oftentimes tell the same story with relatively easily obtained data. And it all depends on what the needs are of the evaluation. So here on the left, I look at 3 case studies in California, Connecticut, and New York, and this is using household level data that we have compiled at the Berkeley lab. The metric here on the y-axis is something we call adopter income bias. And really the point here is that anything above 0 represents adopters that earn more than the median. So if solar were equally distributed with respect to income, we'd expect the median, the middle of these box plots, to be at 0. The dark blue ones are households that did not receive incentives, and we see that those are consistently above 0, which is just the general story. Solar adopters tend to earn more than the median income. The orange boxes are households that did receive incentives, and for those, we do see that they hover around or just below 0, which is what we'd expect. So basically, what this analysis tells us is a confirmation that LMI incentives are going to LMI households. And another thing that this shows us is that modeled data, so these are modeled incomes, they are imperfect. Clearly, in some cases, the distributions go up to, say, $100,000 per year over median income. That really represents modeling error. And you're going to have modeling error in any model. But in general, this shows that the model incomes work to help us demonstrate that LMI incentives are indeed flowing to LMI households. On the right, this is analysis based exclusively on publicly available data. And here I basically just look at how incentives are distributed across zip codes with the goal of isolating the shares of LMI in low income zip codes, defined in a certain way that you can get the details from in the report. And the key point here is that LMI incentive or recipients compose greater shares in low income zip codes. And I guess conceptually, this tells the exact same story as what we see on the left. But the key point being, this is all based on free, easily obtainable data. We go a bit more into the details in the report about the implications of this. But again, you can demonstrate using easily obtainable data that LMI incentives are indeed flowing to LMI households. Go to the next slide. So those were descriptive analysis. Descriptive meaning we did not control for any potentially confounding factors. The next step is to do some type of identification. And the reason we want to do this is really based on 2 confounding factors that come up a lot in program evaluation. The first, I always cringe when I say this. I don't really like the term free riding, but this is the standard term in program evaluation. Free riding refers to folks that received an incentive that would have taken the action anyways. So in this case, there will be some households that were incentivized to adopt solar that would have adopted anyways. There's ways to test for this, and the reason you want to test for it is you want to exclude households, because if you are including those households in impact, you will overestimate the program's actual impact. Those are households that would have adopted even without the incentive. The second key confounding factor are these spillovers, and this basically goes in the opposite direction. We know which is very well established in solar research, that solar tends to spread. Once a household has adopted solar, they have solar panels on their roof, their neighbors become much more likely to adopt. So solar has this, we used to call it a contagious effect. We really need to find a better term for it nowadays, but this peer effect is really important. So the idea here is if you can get solar panels into, say, a low-income neighborhood, that will increase the probability that other neighbors in that neighborhood will adopt themselves. So that could be generate these spillover impacts. By failing to account for the spillovers, you may underestimate a program's true impact. So the key point, we want to somehow model and test the possibility of free riding and spillovers. The report goes into just a really basic summary of the econometric methods to do that. We do provide an example. We talk about one specific approach that we implemented in a previous paper. Won't go into any of those details here, but it's all in the report. Next slide. And I believe this is my summary slide. So just to go over what I just went over, household level versus location based. The key message being that evaluators can do this even if they don't have great data at their disposal. If they can do evaluations at the household level, that's great. High statistical power, you can get very precise estimates, but that can be difficult to obtain. And location-based it can be quite easy, yields very useful results that oftentimes will tell the exact same story that could be told with household level data, with the obvious trade-off that might be less precise. So it all depends on the goals of the evaluation, the budget of evaluators, but the key story here is that there are data available out there in the universe that one can use to enhance program evaluation capabilities for these programs. And I believe that's it for me. Pass back to Ben. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, we're going to wrap it up with some findings and some recommendations from the research. And I guess recommendations aimed mostly at program administrators. Some key findings. First, as I mentioned, not all programs do evaluations, or at least they don't make them publicly available if they do them. Only about a third of the 46 programs we've identified had publicly available evaluation documents. This could be because a number of programs are fairly new. They haven't really been evaluated yet. A number of programs are small, so they don't have a big budget for evaluation. And sometimes it's the case that a low-income solar program is part of a larger solar program, and they don't break out the evaluation separately. Among the programs that existed, among programs, most programs do some kind of progress report. They track the number of whatever it is they're doing, rebates, grants, installations. But only 4 of the programs we found have done really in-depth program evaluations. Of course, these were longer running and larger programs. The evaluations that we found use a variety of different metrics to track how they're doing. The most common were the number of installations or the number of the amount of expenditures. Less common were looking at impacts on bills or the energy output of their systems or the number of jobs created. So most of these are fairly, first order metrics. They don't really go into greater detail, but some of them you certainly can find that. Number 4, not many of the programs seem to build data collection into the program design. A lot of them seem to do it after the fact. That can impinge on the ability to provide that continuous improvement feedback as the program goes. Some programs, however, had very specific goals and had very specific metrics that aligned with evaluating those goals. Lastly, among the findings, as Eric talked about, Extending the analysis with publicly available sources can be a very cost-effective way to increase the value of your evaluation. I think I mentioned the Connecticut Green Bank evaluation used that approach. One point Eric has made earlier when I was in other venues is that people tend to live, people within a zip code or a neighborhood tend to have a similar economic profile, similar income levels and home values and so on. So it's rare to find $1 million house next to a low-income house. So using zip code level or census tract level data can really, as Eric said, can be a reasonably good approximation for household income. A few recommended best practices that we take away from this analysis. Doing continuous evaluation is, I think, important, especially as programs are early, in their early days. I don't think it's true that we know what the single best approach is for using solar to deliver benefits to low-income customers. I think we're seeing kind of a switch to community solar as a preferred approach. And we're also seeing a switch among solar policy in general, away from just generally incentivizing solar toward incentives specifically targeted at certain communities and certain demographic profiles. Low-income solar evaluation should be able to draw from the vast experience of energy efficiency evaluation. That's my number 2 recommendation. There is a really very large and very rigorous set of practices in energy efficiency programs. Energy efficiency programs can also be a way to, they can be used as to piggyback on, to identify, to target customers, to do income verification. Really looking at solar as an extension of a way to deliver energy efficiency can be a very efficient way to implement a program. Number 3, I've already talked about how it's good to mix with public data. It's also good to collect maybe more data than you need up front as you go, because the more data you have, the more pieces you can blend together, the more cross-tab analysis you can do to provide greater insights. It would be good over time if, I think this will happen over time. I think as we find out more about what the best strategies are for low-income solar, I think that'll be accompanied by a consensus on how to evaluate those programs. Once we have some more consensus and standardization, then it'll be easier to make comparisons between programs, between solar and efficiency and other types of programs, as well as across states and so on. Number 5, because low-income solar has the goals go well beyond the utility bill, I think it's very important to integrate non-energy impacts as much as possible. Home quality, home value, health and safety, all those kinds of things. Those can be difficult to quantify for sure, but I think they help provide a greater rationale for these programs. And lastly, impact evaluations are looked at as the sort of bottom line metric. How's the program going? But process evaluations, I think, are just as important to explain why a program is succeeding or failing and what needs to be done to change it going forward. So there are more facts and figures in the report, which you can find at solardemographics.lbl.gov. We also have quite a bit of other research projects there, other reports and webinars and data visualization tools. We just recently updated the data source on demographic trends and accompanied that with an updated interactive data visualization tool. So we're turning it over for questions. That's the end of our presentation, and we have a few minutes left for questions. Sam, I think you wanted to, or Nate?
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Eric. We do have a number of questions, and some of the questions cover program mechanics and how specific programs work or how programs work generally. I'm going to steer away from those questions and zero in on program evaluation and specific questions related to that. But before I get into that, there's one question related to I think it's slide 5, an early slide from you, Ben, that had different program elements. And the question is, for the program elements, how do you differentiate finance and incentives as separate categories? Can you provide some examples?
Yeah, I think what we meant by that was that finance was a way to, it's either lending or on-bill financing, for example, whereas an incentive would be more like a rebate or tax credit. So finance would mean it gets paid back in some way.
Great. And a question for you, Eric. Can you give us some more information about what causes the spillover effect?
Sure. So I mentioned this term peer effects, and basically it's the idea that one adoption tends to motivate one's neighbors to adopt as well. And so what I mean by spillover is that if you can get solar panels into a neighborhood where no one's ever seen solar panels in the neighborhood prior, that could motivate others in that neighborhood to think, hey, my neighbor has got solar panels. Maybe that's not as expensive as I thought they were. Maybe I should talk to them, learn about them. I can hear, oh, they're saving some money on the electricity bill. All of that can get momentum flowing to get others in that area to adopt. So essentially, if you get one seed in a neighborhood, that can spill over to get multiple other systems adopted. And I am doing some follow-up work in this space. The theory behind these spillover impacts is really solid. They should definitely exist. And some early research I'm doing suggests that they are out there. It's just a question of estimating. There might be some number, for every 10 systems installed, you get one extra spillover. So it's essentially an extra effect that is not accounted for if you're not thinking about them.
Great, thank you. Next question, and maybe this is for perhaps for both of you, but have you accounted for the effects of net energy metering as part of the benefits evaluation? How do programs treat that, and yeah, how does that play out?
Yeah, that's been a question in California recently. California is looking at a reform of net metering. They're heading for what's called NEM 3.0. We are currently at the version 2.0. And as part of that, the Utility Commission asked a research firm called Verdant Associates to do a cost-benefit analysis of net metering. We had a presentation from Verdant at our last staff meeting. I'd recommend looking at, I forget what their web address is, but if you Google Verdant Associates and look at the NEM 2.0 look back study, you'll see a cost-benefit analysis and evaluation just like this for net metering. It can be it's not as common to evaluate net metering in this way. It's usually used for programs, not policies, but it has been done, and Verdant just did that for the California program.
There were some programs that also were looking specifically into energy bill reduction as a specific benefit that they were tracking, or energy burden reduction if they were also collecting income. And in those cases, they actually did, it's not necessarily accounting for net metering specifically, but it's accounting for the discount on the bill as something that some of these programs did track. So it sort of indirectly, I suppose, answers your question.
Great, thanks for weighing in, Sydney. That's helpful. Next question, why wouldn't the additional benefit to utilities be far greater than 25% since they would be converting a presumably unprofitable customer to a profitable one because of the significant drop in subsidies, perhaps to zero? So I think this relates to Ben, one of the slides you had about different constituencies and benefits to whom.
Yeah, the non-energy benefit in that evaluation, that was the California SASH program. Yeah, the most of the savings, I think something like 90% of the savings, the non-energy savings, were in the form of reduced care and FIRA subsidies. Those are the bill payment assistance programs. Also in the reduced incidence of bill arrearages, people getting behind or being unable to pay their bills. Those were really the lion's share of the non-energy benefits that evaluation found. I think if the question is why didn't it convert it to a benefit cost ratio of greater than 1, I think it really depends on the cost of creating that savings, right? That was a 2015 evaluation looking at, I think, 2013 program data. Solar was still quite expensive in 2013. That's 8 years ago. I think the numbers are probably a lot more favorable now. Solar is much cheaper now, and electric rates are higher. So the benefits, the cost of solar is lower, the benefit of solar is higher now. I'd be interested actually to see, I mean, the past year with the pandemic has created a real epidemic of arrearages. People have been really unable to pay bills really across the country. So I imagine, excuse me, I imagine that the value of that, you know, the energy assistance and the value of reduced arrearages is probably even higher in the past year.
Thank you. And we're getting close to the end of our hour together. So so I'm going to ask just one more question, and then we'll close out. Thanks to all the great questions. We won't get to all of them, but appreciate the active audience. The question is, what happens, or how do you evaluate when the cost benefit analysis, this is related to the prior question, is different for different constituencies? How do you strike the balance between benefits to a certain segment of society versus costs that might be socialized? Do you have any suggestions for how when you come up with look at those different constituencies, how those are treated? And
yeah, yeah, those are the different cost tests, the 5 different ones I mentioned there. They all have different implications. I think ultimately, I think actually one comment I remember reading was that the RIM test, the ratepayer impact test, is basically impossible to create a positive ratio. But anyway, I think it really boils down to really a policy judgment call about whether a program is worth pursuing, even though it may not have positive benefit cost ratio, because it creates benefits for one party or another. I think that's especially true with low-income programs. I think we decided a long time ago that they really don't need to be cost effective because they're delivering benefits to people where the benefits are extremely valuable. So we have, 20, 30 years of doing low-income energy efficiency programs, and really they've never been cost effective, but we do them because we want to help the poor. So I think that's a perfectly legitimate policy call to make.
wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Ben, Eric, and Sydney for being with us and your presentations. I want to encourage folks that you can download the report and check it out. There's a link in the webinar announcement to that report, and we'll include a link to it in follow-up information that we send out as well. And also thanks to our audience, and apologies for not getting to all the great questions. But with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Samantha, to close out and tell us about an upcoming webinar.
Great, thank you, Nate. And thank you also, Ben, Eric, and Sydney for a great webinar. So we have another webinar coming up next Wednesday. Nate is also hosting that one. And the topic is evaluating the financial performance of Connecticut's low and moderate income solar lease program. And the guest speaker for that, Jeff Deason, is also from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. So we hope you can attend that. That should be an interesting topic. You can read more and register at cisa.org/webinars. So thank you again, everyone. We hope to see you next week.